Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be doing an extra special video on how to work with your teammates in the game of War Thunder. Now this might seem like a somewhat peculiar topic to just come up with out of the blue, however it turns out I have been grinding a lot of Germany, especially around 10.7, and the teammates there are less than optimal. And the first topic, and the one that German players tend to be the worst at, is popping smoke, such as this awesome individual who decides to smoke out the B point. Of course, simply stating that something is a problem is not really that useful. You have to go into why it is a problem, and for this particular instance, this individual has multiple teammates around them, including myself, and all of us, including them, have working guns and working engines. So if the objective is to simply block line of sight so that an enemy doesn't come around the corner and shoot you, well, we can solve that problem by just shooting the enemy first. You are allowed to shoot back in War Thunder, although sometimes I do think my teammates haven't got this memo. Additionally, smoking out B point in this way does present another issue because B point has good line of sight to enemies going directly from their spawn to the hill at the north, and the hill at the north can be somewhat difficult to contest enemies on, so hitting them while they're moving from their spawn to that point is actually pretty useful, and this smoke specifically blocks us from doing it. In essence, this person is kind of hurting a lot of their teammates, and for no real benefit. There's no enemy they're specifically stopping from interacting with us in this situation. So this is what I would objectively call a pretty bad smoke, as it doesn't really have any reason to exist, and it does nothing but hurt your teammates and stop them from pushing forward or controlling sight lines at the beginning of the map. Now, popping normal smoke is somewhat suboptimal, but popping ESS smoke, where people with thermals can see through them, can be even worse, because you don't have any way of knowing whether or not your teammates or your enemies have thermals unlocked, even if they have them available for that vehicle, so you could just be blinding your teammate while not doing anything to the enemy. Now, going from one video where smoke was obviously the wrong call to another one where it's pretty obviously and unambiguously the right call, in this scenario, we know multiple enemies are shooting at us, we still have the ability to move. However, enemies are shooting at us, we lost our gun, and there is also a helicopter up with laser guided missiles that are going to be defeated by the smoke. So in this scenario, there's not much question that you should definitely pop smoke, especially because there are no other teammates nearby, so I'm not potentially blocking anybody else's line of sight. This is one of those very easy scenarios because obviously the smoke has basically no chance of hurting my team, and I can't really return fire anyway. Additionally, you'll notice I like to change direction a lot in smoke, that way you're not moving in a predictable pattern, which is a big mistake a lot of people make. Now in the scenario in the background, it's a little more complicated as to whether or not I should use smoke. We have a Lavad that is hitting me and my teammate from long range. My teammate has been disabled, and in this scenario, the reason I opt to ultimately try to smoke the repair is simply because while the Lavad is unable to pen me or my teammate at this distance, they can potentially knock out things like tracks and barrels, and if the Lavad knocks out my barrel and an enemy stumbles across me and my teammate in this position, we're both basically dead. So what I'm trying to do here is to smoke it out to prevent the likelihood of that happening. Now this is also another scenario where it's important to be aware of your teammates, because if the band cannon had simply used the request for team assistance, I could have towed him off of this position, and this would have been a much easier repair. So one thing that you always want to do when you're in a position like this, or in general when you get immobilized, is just get used to reflexively hitting that request team assistance button. That way, if you're in a bad position, your teammates can potentially drag you out of it. Now this engagement is a little more interesting because, as you can see in the background, an Abrams has come up behind one of my teammates and we ultimately disable and take it out, but you'll notice I don't immediately rush to help my teammate, and that's because my teammate is in a somewhat exposed position and I want to maintain the crossfire. Essentially, if I run over to help my teammate, I risk both of us getting taken out by essentially the same enemy. On top of that, we're on a zone that we control, so the repair timer on my teammate is already relatively short, so my teammate should be able to handle this on their own, especially if I can keep the enemies off of them for long enough for them to repair. A short time later, we see a T-72 knocks out our barrel, and we immediately machine gun the T-72, and it looks like the T-72 has one of its smoke grenades hit. So in this scenario, even though I can still move, I opt to simply repair on point and pop smoke, because my teammate is far enough to the side that I'm not getting in the way of their line of sight, and additionally, if the enemy is blinded, they won't necessarily know where I am. The bigger concern is that another enemy will come by and see me, so using the smoke to conceal myself from potentially a second enemy is a higher priority than necessarily trying to keep the line of sight open. Now in the first fight from this clip, we get to see a great example of where smoke doesn't necessarily help. The enemy enemy smokes right away, but also moves in a fairly predictable direction, and our reload is fast enough that we're able to knock out their engine, and then ultimately knock out the rest of their vehicle relatively easily. So it's important to remember that in these situations, you're in Jesus take the wheel mode, you need your teammates to help you anyway, so you might as well just not smoke and hope that one of them comes along. So in this scenario, the smoke by my teammate is very dubious and doesn't make a lot of sense because my teammate has hard cover, they have a working gun, they have a working engine, and they can and do simply retreat behind the hard cover. So why you would smoke and retreat behind the hard cover, I don't really understand the reasoning of that logic. You can just retreat anyway and it's about the same effect. And here we see a perfect example of why you don't smoke in situations like this, because normally if you're holding a corner, you can just look at the corner, and if the enemy comes around it at all, you can shoot him. However, in this scenario, the enemy could pull the corner very hard and come through the smoke, or they could fly out the side like they did. So this effectively gives you two different directions you have to look at or be aware of, and if you completely miss your mark, you're basically in trouble. If the enemy just comes out of the smoke looking directly at you, they're going to get the shot off first, and if the enemy flies around and you're looking into the smoke, you're not going to be able to swing your gun on target anywhere near fast enough to take them down. I feel like that's one of those fights that nobody really wants to talk about afterwards because it was just bad all around on all sides. Of course, upon getting hit once, my teammate decides that with a perfectly functional engine and not a functioning gun, and also a teammate right next to him, that the correct answer is to pop smoke yet again. Now in this scenario, he knows he has a teammate next to him with a working gun because he literally just helped me fix it 2 seconds earlier. So I have no idea why you would pop smoke in this scenario. Your best hope of survival is that I can take out any enemy that tries to push us, and it turns out I do. But in this scenario, you can't do anything. You are entirely reliant on your team, so why would you blind your team and make their job harder? While I can fully appreciate that as a less experienced player, it's hard to take in all of this information while stuff is happening quickly, you always need to remember that your teammates that are around you can potentially help you and often can be your greatest resource, especially when you're in a bad situation. In fact, in many situations, they are your best chance of survival, so you do need to be at least somewhat aware of where they are and what they can potentially do, especially if you are getting pushed in a scenario like this. Now, to briefly recap usage of smoke in times where it is and is not a good idea, generally speaking, if you can still move and shoot, it's not the greatest idea to pop smoke. Additionally, if you can still shoot at all, even if you can't move, it is more often than not a good idea to avoid popping smoke, especially because even if the enemy knows where you are, as long as you can return fire and you can threaten to kill them in return, usually you don't want to pop smoke. You want to keep that threat available even if you can't see them right now. A scenario where smoke could potentially save you is a scenario where you've eliminated the enemy or a teammate has and you don't have the ability to return fire or move, because in this scenario no enemy currently knows exactly where you are within that smoke, and you don't want an enemy simply stumbling across you and getting a free kill while you're repairing. Another scenario where it basically always makes sense to smoke is if you see an enemy fire a fire and forget missile at you, such as what you can see at the higher battle ratings, because most of these are either optical or infrared and can often lose track in smoke, especially if you pop smoke and then move afterwards. Laser guided missiles that use the IOG targeting, such as the Hellfire, also struggle to hit targets reliably in smoke, so if you see an enemy using these missiles or you get a laser warning, it's often not a bad idea to pop smoke preemptively there as well. Another scenario where smoke can potentially be used is if you're crossing in front of the enemy spawn, or you're in some other scenario where enemies can shoot you from multiple directions and you really want to narrow that down so you don't have to worry about all of those directions at once. Obviously, all the things I've just mentioned are kind of just general statements, and smoke is very contextual, so you will have to kind of feel it out on a case-by-case basis, but you do need to always keep in mind, can I move? Can I return fire? Do I have teammates around me that need this line of sight? Now, this engagement, we're going to be looking at something that a lot of new players fail to really consider or think about all that much, and that is the importance of splitting up. Now, when I say splitting up, I'm not necessarily talking about going on opposite ends of the map, but rather simply approaching an engagement engagement from different angles so that both you and your opponent are presenting different problems the enemy has to deal with. In the engagement in the background, the 9040C is coming from the left, I'm coming from the right, and all of the enemies that are looking at the 9040C I am simply taking out with relative ease so that both of us can simply keep pushing quickly. Because we're basically separated by 180 degrees, your opponent has to look in two opposite directions at once. So if the enemy team is not adequately coordinated to have two different people looking in two different directions, you can easily sneak up on multiple people at the same time by doing these kind of tactics. This of course also brings up a valid point that I've brought up several times in the past, and that is you always going to be looking in directions that your team isn't looking, because that's where you're most likely to get flanked by. If you have three teammates looking in one direction, you continuing to look in that same direction doesn't really add anything. Adding and expanding on that point, there's usually not that much of a use in having multiple people in the same camping spot at the same time. One gets the job done, two gives you some redundancy, but when you start getting 3 or 4 people in the same camping spot, you're just wasting personnel. You get severely diminishing returns. You don't need that many guns covering a single sight line. So to an extent, if you look around and you see there are 4 or 5 other people all going the exact same direction as you, it's probably time to start considering going somewhere else. Now in the next fight on the same map, I'm trying to go around to the right to catch what I believe is an Abrams because I can hear the engine noise, and I think the Dardo is on the left, but then I realize the Dardo is following me, so I decide to turn around because I don't want both of us to cover the same angle at the same time. Ideally, we want to wrap from both sides so that the Abrams doesn't really have anything it can do, and he can't focus on both of us at once, so whoever he's looking at, the other person can just get a shot in. That being said, the Abrams does just push the Dardo and fail to kill it, and we take it out, so it ends up working out regardless. However, the Dardo's position doesn't make the most sense because the Dardo has its main anti-tank missiles on the left and right, and the concrete obstacle in front of it that is watching the corner has enough obstruction that it's very unreliable to try and hit those missiles in that position. So all you can really use is the autocannon through the separation between the two, whereas the Abrams, if it had just poked forward a little, could have just shot around straight into its turret and knocked it out. In that respect, if the Dardo had simply held the corner behind me and allowed me to hold that corner, we would have had a much better chance of success. So this is one of those scenarios where it worked out, but it worked out in a very suboptimal way that easily could have gone sideways. Now for the last clip for today, I'm in the Ocelot and I don't really have any other ground spawns, and my other two teammates are currently a Gepard and an Al-Khalid. The Al-Khalid is getting pretty close to a nuke. There's only about 2 to 3 enemies left, so my priority with this point in the Ocelot is simply to support the Khalid, even if it means I'm going to die in the process. I use the scouting to mark both a BMP-3 and a Terms for the Al-Khalid, who's going to attempt to come in from the flank, and I also notice the Terms pops a shot at the Ocelot's launchers. With that in mind, I figure I can bait shots with the Ocelot's launchers because the Terms doesn't seem like the most intelligent player in the world. The Terms then proceeds to take me out because apparently they loaded a Heat FS round despite knowing that the Al-Khalid was around, and I'm not really sure why they did that, but as you can see in the kill feed, the Terms choosing to engage me instead of paying attention to the Al-Khalid did result in both them and the BMP-3 getting taken out. In this scenario, while the Ocelot scouting you is slightly annoying, the Ocelot has no capacity whatsoever to engage ground targets, so you can safely ignore it until the much more threatening Al-Khalid is down, and that was definitely the enemy's mistake in this scenario. Between the scouting assist and the zone cap, I was able to get enough spawn points for a BO-105, and I decided to play it somewhat aggressively to try and take out or bait enemy anti-air into shooting at me while our nuke was getting readied and flying towards the ground battlefield. We did end up winning this match, but it could have easily gone the other way, especially if the Al-Khalid got taken out. And that concludes the video for today. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun, hope you learned something. If you did, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. I've always felt like understanding and utilizing your team as a resource is probably one of the least understood aspects of the game of War Thunder. So opportunities to highlight both successes and failures with teamwork, I feel, are one of the best ways to improve your skills as a player. Of course, that's just my opinion on the matter. Let me know down in the comments below if you find your teammates to be particularly helpful or even in some cases very unhelpful in certain scenarios. I always love to read that. As always, Donkey Beta Shoes.